Welcome to Under the Radar, a show about independent iOS app development. I'm Marco Arment.
And I'm David Smith. Under the Radar is never longer than 30 minutes, so let's get started. So before we dive into our actual main topic for today, I just wanted to have a brief, programming note that we've started to publish these episodes on YouTube as well as our regular RSS syndication means. And this is mostly just an experiment. We're not changing anything about the core show. It's just, we're continuing on Relay, continuing to publish via RSS and MP3. That is the show. But this is an experiment that we're trying. So I just wanted to mention it in case that is a preferred mechanism for you, that if you like, listening to things via YouTube for whatever reason, that is something that's there. There'll be a link in the show notes, or I'm sure if you just go to YouTube and search for Under the Radar, you'll find it. So I just wanted to mention that briefly.
So please like, comment, and subscribe.
Like, comment, subscribe, smash that like button, do all those things, hit the bell. I think you're supposed to hit a bell. I'm not really sure.
Is there a bell there too?
There's a bell. Hit the bell.
Is that different from thumbs up?
I think it's different.
And is that different from like? Or is thumbs up like?
I think thumbs up is liking, and
What's
then
the
bell
bell?
is wanting, if you want notifications, I think. you want to hit that bell.
But it's different from subscribing.
Yeah, I mean, if there's any button underneath something and it's positive, go ahead and press it.
You go.
And maybe push it 3 times just in case.
Well, you can go back to all of our 100 and whatever episodes and do it on all of them.
Exactly. Go ahead and do it for all of our past episodes. Maybe leave some comments. Anyway. So our main topic today is we're going to talk through. This week there was a article published on Bloomberg by Mark Gurman, which is the way many of these Apple News things start. And basically, he has a tip, a lead, a rumor that Apple is working on a secret project codenamed Marzipan, which is a project to create a unified system for iOS and Mac apps to run together. And this is something that we've talked about. I was looking up, way back in the early days of the show, even we were talking about some of the challenges of being iOS developers and coming to the Mac and, wishing for there to be an easier path. And so, if this actually is a thing, which in a certain sense, when I saw this, it's it seems eventually this was going to happen. To use the infinite timescale argument, this was somewhat inevitable that eventually Apple was going to consolidate their platforms. And if the rumor's true, and they're going to be doing it in next summer, probably would be their goal. With WWDC, iOS 12, the next version of macOS, it's going to be. If that's actually true, this is a really interesting thing, and I think it'll create a lot of interesting opportunities for development. I think it would be really interesting from a learning, the abilities that you get from learning how to make Apple apps, that suddenly you can make them on multiple platforms and distribute them potentially in different ways. I think it has a lot of implications potentially on the business side, and is probably mixed news for existing Mac developers, that suddenly, being all of the skills and things that you have from being a Mac developer may be slightly less significant or unique. So anyway, it seemed like an interesting thing to kind of unpack, given our history with this topic.
And this is a huge disclaimer that this is just a rumor published in one article literally today as we record, an hour ago. So this is not only unabashedly our hot take on it, and we haven't had a whole lot of time to think about it, and we have no additional information, but also it's simply one article from Mark Gurman, and his track record has been okay, but not perfect. So especially recently, it seems like it's kind of getting worse, honestly. But so take this all with a grain of salt. This is a rumor. This is not fact. This has not been confirmed or commented on by Apple, and probably won't be for some time, if ever. So all that said, I am super excited about this.
Yeah.
So, to me, I'm an iOS developer. I happen to have made a couple of little Mac apps, but it was like pulling teeth because I am not an AppKit expert. I am not a Mac development expert, even though I have used the Mac for a very long time. I have not developed for it really in any serious capacity ever. I've done little toy things, but that's about it. So for me, when I program on the Mac, it feels, first of all, feels very antiquated in some ways. Not everything, but in some ways, because AppKit is a much older API than UIKit. It has a lot more baggage. UIKit was created in part from the lessons they learned from AppKit like 10 years earlier or whatever it was. So, AppKit is very, very cumbersome for me as an iOS developer to use, because it's like, take this thing that I'm familiar with and change a lot of how it works, add a whole bunch of stuff you have to deal with, make a lot of stuff different for no good reason by modern standards. Like maybe it was that way for some time or forever ago, but now it's like, if you look at what the needs are now for these platforms, like a lot of things are just different for no good reason anymore, or for legacy reasons that no longer apply or shouldn't need to apply. And so AppKit development is very slow, very cumbersome for iOS developers. And because of that, it's also just expensive. And in the time it takes and the resources it takes, if you have to hire Mac programmers, there are way fewer of them than there are iOS programmers, so it's probably more expensive for big companies as well. And the Mac user base is smaller than the iOS user base by a good amount. And so the result of this has been so far that iOS developers, big and small, which basically means all app developers these days, like pretty much every major business and service has iOS apps, almost every major developer either ignores the Mac completely as a platform for their application or service, or they treat it as a second-class citizen, because it has smaller numbers of people, and it's way harder and more expensive for most people to develop for. So this is a problem. So even if you ignore the technical arguments, even if fans of AppKit can tell us why it's better in certain ways, which it is, or why it's more advanced in a lot of ways, which it is, or why things are done this way for good reasons, which they are, all of that is secondary to this massive economics problem of there's tons of people writing iOS code and who can write iOS code. It's like this massive, like, universal language now for mobile apps because of the market realities of these platforms. So, like, every business is writing iOS apps. But the Mac is like, if we get to it, maybe someday, or if you write a Mac app, it's maybe an Electron app or some other kind of, wrapper or like cross-platform language where you're really just writing like JavaScript or web code or something like that, and it's being run in WebKit on a Mac, which is fine. Like big apps like Slack are done that way. It's fine, but it's not good. And there's lots of major downsides to that kind of app, like especially like memory usage and performance, stuff like that, native integration type stuff. So that's not a great situation to be in. And also just a lot of apps just don't have native apps on the Mac. They just use websites. It's like, all right, well, you can log into our website and do this. And I am a huge example of this in my own head, obviously. This is exactly how Overcast works. Like, I don't have a Mac app. I have considered making a Mac app before. There are a couple of podcast apps that have made Mac apps, and usually they have killed them. Like usually, like the other indie podcast apps that made Mac versions seemed to like stop development afterwards. Like it seemed like that was too much of a burden, and it just was the last nail in the coffin or something. And I'm afraid of that happening to me if I would do the same thing, because it's a totally different platform. Like if I were to try to port Overcast to Mac today, I could very easily just copy over and use the core library functions of things like the database, the sync engine, and most or all of the audio engine, because like all those low-level frameworks have been unified for the most part with not a lot of exceptions, at least in the way I'm using them. But the UI would have to be completely rewritten from scratch. And you can make an argument, and many people have, that you should write custom UIs from scratch for a completely different new platform than what you've written before. Because and in an ideal world, that's true. In an ideal world, yes, I would write a whole custom Mac UI because the Mac is not iOS. Controls are totally different. The environment's totally different. Windowing is totally different. Like there's all sorts of major platform differences between the two that you shouldn't just like be running an iOS app in a window on the Mac. Like that's not a great way to do this. But the reality is, because developing on the Mac is such a huge investment for an established iOS developer, and because there are way more of us than Mac developers, and that's probably going to continue to go that direction. Because of these economic differences, the reality is not that we are choosing between having good Mac apps and having some kind of cross-platform thing. The reality is that we're choosing between having the cross-platform thing or no Mac apps. And it's not to say that the entire Mac app market will go away that exists today. We don't know what this is. This could be just another option. This could be like another framework you can use, a platform that you can use to develop Mac apps with as an alternative to AppKit. That's how I would guess they would do it, because Apple has a whole bunch of AppKit code themselves. They're not going to get rid of AppKit. So I think the existing Mac market is fine, and they would be totally fine to keep going in that way. I don't think this is a threat to them in the short term. In the long term, it probably is, but I think in the long term, it's very clear that Apple has not been moving AppKit forward very aggressively. They have not been investing heavily into it, just like the rest of the Mac, basically.
Yeah, and I think the biggest threat, honestly, probably to Mac developers is just the devaluing in some ways of their unique skill. Like, it reminds me of people who are, say, Fortran developers or COBOL developers, right? Like, if you have this very distinctive skill, that if you are a AppKit genius, like, that is a unique, marketable, valuable thing right now. That if a company decides they want a Mac app, there's not as many people who can do an exceptional job of that. And in a weird way, that might be slightly devalued by this, just in the sense that if it's something that is possible for a broader range of people, to do. But I mean, the thing is, like, it's a weird thing when you start to get into these apps won't be as good potentially, which is, I think, a common reaction to this kind of thing. It's like, well, they're, people are just going to make blown up iPhone apps. And maybe that's true. I mean, in many ways, it makes me think of the iPad, though, where I think for years, the iPad and the way that it was sort of technically structured was that while it was still UIKit under, in terms of the libraries you were using, the way that you were encouraged to develop an iPad app was that it was a completely separate sort of visual fork in your application that you would launch into your iPad app or you would launch into your iPhone app. And then with the size classing changes and the introduction of the slide over and this, the 1/4 width iPad apps and all these things, that largely went away. I think there was the encouragement started to become that it's like being an adaptable iPhone app is good enough and is probably sufficient for most situations and may not be optimized, that when you are running that app on, on the biggest, whatever, the 12-inch iPad Pro, like, it's not going to be ideal potentially, but it works and it will be there. And it's certainly better than just having the 2X iPhone app blow up version, which was what, the situation we found ourselves in before. And I expect we would have a similar thing, moving to the Mac, where, if your app has an iPad app, imagine running that iPad app on a Mac, and you're probably pretty close to something that is very usable, workable, would feel it may not feel native in the sense of what we consider native now, but the reality is probably for an increasing number of people, what feels native and natural is iOS, and the Mac is the foreign thing. And it could even be reassuring and encouraging to somebody who comes to, if they come to the Mac and the Mac feels like iOS, like the thing they know, that may actually be a positive rather than a negative for them. And so I think dismissing this in any way for it's going to lead to these kind of, these shovelware, iPhone apps that are just going to be blown up onto the screen or, running in teeny little windows. It's maybe. But having something, if suddenly there now being 1 million new apps available for the Mac, that would be awesome. That would be, I think, there's no world in which that's a bad thing. I don't think having that opportunity, I like that as something, maybe they won't work wonderfully. Maybe it's not perfect, but it's not like the Mac is this flourishing ecosystem that is continuing to grow and develop and attract new developers, in droves. It's No, it's not. And it's like, I think this is it's easy to perhaps get stuck on the ideal sense of what you could imagine versus the pragmatic reality of if Apple went down this road, if they made it really easy for iOS developers to essentially just add, like, this app can run on the Mac, and when it's in the Mac, it has maybe a slightly different size class, but otherwise, like, is pretty much just the same. Like, that's pretty cool to me. Like, I'm on board with that. I think that would be really interesting. And overall, like, it just creates so much more opportunity, and it creates such an increased value in learning how to make iOS apps or UIKit or whatever this new thing is. It's like that all that skill and development that we've developed now suddenly becomes that much more valuable and interesting.
We are sponsored this week by FreshBooks. To all the freelancers out there, you know how important it is to make smart decisions for your business. FreshBooks can save you hours and hours with their cloud accounting software for freelancers that is ridiculously easy to use. By simplifying tasks like invoicing, tracking expenses, and getting paid online, FreshBooks has drastically reduced the time it takes for over 10 million people to deal with their paperwork. FreshBooks has so many great features that make it just easy to get paid. So, for instance, when you email a client, FreshBooks can show you whether they've seen the invoice or not, which puts an end to the guessing games and the awkward conversations. And they automate late payment email reminders, so you can spend less time chasing down late payments and more time just doing your work. FreshBooks may now have over 10 million users, but they've managed to stay a pretty small company also, landing them the title of Small Giant on Forbes' list of best small companies this year. If you're listening to this and you are not using FreshBooks yet, now is the time to try it. FreshBooks is offering an unrestricted 30-day free trial for listeners of this show with no credit card required. All you have to do is go to freshbooks.com/radar and enter Under the Radar in the How Did You Hear About Us section. Thank you so much to FreshBooks for their support of this show. So you mentioned a minute ago the idea of being ideal versus pragmatic, and I think this is the overall theme of this kind of concept. Like, assuming this is real, or if this happens, real versus pragmatic is an argument that a lot of people have trouble with, because it seems unfair or unjust or non-ideal especially for people who really care a lot, which is pretty common in the Mac fan community, because that's the kind of people who historically have loved Apple products because Apple really cared a lot. But it's a very common, like, mental friction to get over, that, like, sometimes the best solution is actually the most pragmatic one, which might not be the like, objectively, like, best quality one, or the one that you want, or the one that you think should be. Like, I wrote an article forever ago on my blog called Right versus Pragmatic that was actually about bathroom trash can placement. But this is, it's a similar argument, which is like, you can make a good argument that what should happen is everyone who wants to make a Mac app should do it like the most, like, native, original, old school way, which is AppKit. Sorry, classic Mac people. I know this is not old school to you, but to us, like, AppKit is old school these days. And you can make a great argument that all Mac apps should be AppKit and should be fully native and should be designed from scratch for the Mac, with the Mac in mind. And you're right, that should be the case. But the reality is different. The reality is that the Mac is a neglected platform by a lot of people these days, including, on many levels, Apple. Apple is not able to keep up with their own apps doing very well on the Mac anymore. Apple versions of their cross-platform apps, the Mac versions, like Photos, usually have fewer features, or like Notes. Like, they usually have fewer features, or they have more bugs, or they don't even really take advantage fully of the Mac itself, or they're just kind of weird designs that never get touched, like reminders. And so even Apple can't keep up with their own apps, their own first-party apps on this platform. Even they are having trouble maintaining these two different platforms and justifying the effort it takes to move the Mac forward meaningfully. So, if our only the ideal choice is everyone should invest infinitely into the Mac until everything can be great, but that isn't one of our choices in reality. In reality, our choices are, well, here's how people actually work. Here's the actual economics, actual trade-offs that are involved here. And so our actual choice is between moving in a direction like this rumor, which is a more unified UI framework, more unified app platform between Mac and iOS, or having the Mac continue to languish, having a lot more apps switch to like, the WebKit Electron kind of style where everything is non-native anyway and badly performing and a huge RAM hog, which makes your Mac suck more. Like, that's the alternative here. It's not, the alternative is not that we're going to, educate the world into using AppKit. That ship has sailed. That's not going to happen. So if these are our options, which, newsflash, they are, I'd rather have the option that gives us more Mac apps than the option that gives us fewer, crappier ones.
Yeah, and I think, too, it's also, this creates so many interesting possibilities. Like, and some of them are kind of tangential, but like for me, I'm kind of excited about the prospect of being able to ship iOS apps without needing a sandbox or app review, potentially.
That's interesting.
Like, suddenly that, like, I mean, it's just so, all of the apps, for the most part, that I've ever shipped have to go through app review, are from the App Store, and that constrains and limits the types of things that I can do, the types of risks I want to take. Like, I have been bit by app review enough times that, there's a certain cautiousness and carefulness that I have to adopt when I'm working on my apps. It's kind of interesting that for me to be able to use the skills I have at this point, potentially to ship apps, I would hope anyway that if Apple did something like this, that it wouldn't be, only available. You'd only be able, somehow able to run these apps if they came from the Mac App Store. Like, hopefully you would be able to just run them independently as Mac apps, with the developer ID, code signing, that kind of that level of security that I could just, sign it myself, put it out on my website, and distribute it. Like, that's a really interesting opportunity and possibility, and allows for new things. And like, that's really cool to me. Like, those types of things are not, the strict goal of this, but it's like creates these new opportunities. And I love situations that it's like it takes something that is existing and creates new opportunities for it. That I don't exactly know. Like, if tomorrow Apple announced this platform, then it's like, we've added this great new thing. You can, with relatively little effort, make one of your existing iOS apps run nicely and natively on the Mac. Like, I don't know exactly what I would do, but I would give some serious thought to what I could do with that. Because there's a lot of interesting things that I think become possible in that world. And things that I could imagine wanting to try and experiment with in a bit more of a creative way. And it's nice to not have it over the back of my mind. Well, this has to go through app review. This has to, be conformant with all of the app review stuff. And so if I now have this, this alternative place that I can go and experiment, that's really cool too.
And a lot of the initial reaction has also focused on user pricing expectations and things like devaluing Mac apps to iOS app levels. And this is certainly a reasonable concern for people to have. But I think, I kind of think a combination of two conflicting viewpoints. Either A, it won't do that, but B, that ship has already sailed and that already has happened. The Mac justifies higher prices today for a lot of apps, not because they were difficult to write, but because, not. I assume AppKit developers wouldn't classify it as difficult, but you know what I mean. Like, not because they were written in AppKit. That's not why they're expensive compared to iOS apps. And I think if you look at the actual pricing history of a lot of Mac apps, there's already been downward pressure on pricing by quite a lot and for quite a long time, ever since the iOS App Store shipped at all. So I think that ship has already sailed to a large degree. And if there was already pressure on your app to get its price down, that pressure will still be there. If there wasn't already pressure on your app to get its price down, well, first of all, you probably aren't charging enough. But second of all, the reason why Mac apps have been able to charge good money is often because they actually deliver meaningful value to people in a way that they are willing to pay for. And so that's things like apps people use to get their work done, very specialized apps that there really aren't good alternatives for, apps that save people significant amounts of time in their day. That's the reason why app prices have been pushed down is not because Apple won't give us, trials or upgrades or whatever it is in the App Store. Like, whatever we're complaining about that year, that's not the reason why prices have been pushed down. The reason is because on iOS, there's tons of developers, so there's tons of competition, and most developers expect to be able to make money from just good work, regardless of how much value it delivers to the customer. On the Mac, the apps that make money are not just any Mac apps. They're apps that, like, you know, I'm willing to pay like $50 for an app that helps me produce podcasts every week because that's my job. You know, I'm willing to pay good money for tools. Like I think my Git app was like $80. I consider that a great value. Paint Code, my icon drawing app, I think was $100. That was also a great value. You know, like the apps that I use to get my job done or that save me significant time are valuable and are worth paying for. And if this iOS, you know, to Mac crossover app thing happens, that will still be the case. The only risk to pricing on the large scale, I think, is that this will bring a lot more developers to the platform. And so there will just be more competition. But I think, you know, history of the world has proven that that's generally a good thing, even if it might not be good for certain people who are there now, who have had the platform more to themselves and have kind of locked up the whole market just by the, you know, difficulty or obscurity of the platform, you know, as part of a contributing factor. If you now have more competition, more people can develop Mac apps, yeah, that might not be good for like the handful of people who are there already, but it's really good for the users and for pretty much everyone else, and all those new developers who can now make careers here where they weren't before. So those are the concerns, but I think those are, you know, either unwarranted or missing the big picture.
Yeah, and I think too, if your business if its sustainability is fragile to the degree that the introduction of additional competitors makes it fall apart.
Yeah.
Like, you are in a bad position to start with. And like, I really have genuine sympathy for people who find themselves in that situation. I've been in that situation, like early days of being an iOS developer, like, whatever, 8 years ago. It was really like, I could make good money from being in the App Store just because there weren't that many other apps in the App Store. So being one of them was great. But eventually, like, that gravy train came to an end, and I had to adapt and I had to move on. And that process has been difficult, and that process has not always been comfortable. But like, that is the reality, and it's the understanding that, you know, the position I found myself in back then was not because of something that I was entitled to or had, uniquely achieved. It's like, it was more a circumstance of timing, of luck, of being in the right place at the right time. And eventually that time changed. And I think it'll be the same thing here. And it's like, it's just going to be this question of you're finding a way to bridge the gap. And it's like, well, if you're an existing Mac app and you have, like, if anything, you have this great head start because you can presumably make apps that still stand out and that are still better than an app that is not really, is not coming from somebody with that length of experience. Even if you are still, developing an iOS or whatever the equivalent, framework that this is going to be. I would imagine and expect that if you are a lifelong Mac developer and you start developing a new Mac app with these tools, it should be better. It should be more informed, have more, have stand out in a way that would, give it an advantage. But the reality is, it's like, I've heard, it's like, you could imagine the worry. It's like, well, people are just going to expect to get the Mac app for free when they get the iPhone app. And it's like, yeah, probably.
They already expect that.
They already do. And this is just the next form of that. And this is the next place this is going to happen. And that's not great. That's uncomfortable. But I think it's also, in some ways, it's necessary for the platform to move forward. And so it's really sad and tricky and complicated. And I have great sympathy for people who find themselves in that situation. But that's, that's where this tide is rising to. And we're just going to have to, get in our boats and hope for the best.
Thanks for listening, everybody. And we'll talk to you next week.
Bye.